Good evening. Good to see you all, and glad for whoever is watching there. We are going to continue our digging and discovering in the book of Genesis, using these tools to help us dig out God's intended message so we can be faithful and know the power of His Word, and not just sharing our own words, even with an open Bible. That still can happen, can it? So we've begun looking at Genesis, and we looked last week at this principle or tool of genre, and seeing how the characteristics of the different literature in the Bible, like the characteristics of different fruit, let us know we need to approach it differently. We can't eat all this fruit in exactly the same way. Some we have to peel, some we have to cut. So with the genre in the Bible, there are different characteristics. We noted that Genesis is primarily historical narrative. And so we saw the shape of that, how the setting, the rising tension, the climax, and resolution give shape to the message. So we traced the characters through, we traced the places, the settings through the book, and then we saw the tension. It starts out, everything is very good. And in the end, Joseph says, it is good, God meant good, even though they meant it for evil. And so the sin and rebellion that came in, God had promised someone in Genesis 3:15 who would crush the serpent's head, who would restore the good. And we see that God continues to pursue His good purposes, even from the creation. Though there is sin in the world, even through the sinful actions of people, God is pursuing His good purpose. And so in the end, Joseph is able to forgive and to reconcile because he understands how God is at work even through that evil. Now, we notice that there is another genre called genealogy. Genealogy. And what we want to do now is take another principle that's going to help us understand how Moses uses genealogy through the book of Genesis. And the principle we're going to work with now tonight is structure. Structure. Now, usually we come to the Bible and we start thinking immediately about outlines. We want to outline the text. Well, when we have a narrative structure, a narrative genre with that kind of structure, that's not really an outline as we think of outlining. But the author does have a structure to the way he writes. We picture that structure in terms of units of thought. So if we think about units of thought, sometimes we talk about divisions or dividing the passage up. We prefer this idea of units of thought because units of thought are held together. They're not divided apart, right? And of course, when we talk about divisions in the text, I hope we're not talking about separating the author's message apart, but we're talking about there are movements to the story, right? There is a movement and a direction that the text is headed. Moses is taking us somewhere. And he does that with organized units of thought. He arranges his thoughts in a certain flow that are going to take us across the message. So if we just add a little something in here, we can think of the structure as like a bridge. You've seen these suspension bridges, right? The units of thought are the pillars that hold up the message and that carry the message across. And the author has arranged his thoughts in such a way that we need to follow the way he is thinking and not impose our own structure upon it. That make sense? So we're digging out of the text, not just lessons, but we're digging out of the text. What did the author have in mind? Why did he write it this way? Why did he put these thoughts or this sequence of events in this order of things? Now, we're prone to bring our own ideas to the text. We're prone to bring our own structure to the text as well. Think about it this way. If you go to someone's house and they have a photo album, remember photo albums? Before everything was on here? And they have a photo album, you look and you see, on the first page there's all these pictures of this person and just a tiny little person, and there's a nappy and there's a bath time and whatever. You flip the page and you see, now they're wearing little school uniforms and things like that. And you flip over to the next page and you see, now they're wearing this big white gown and so forth. You flip the page and now they're wearing older clothing. And you say, I see the arrangement of these photos. It's the history of fashion. And that first page is when we were in cavemen, right? And we weren't wearing much for clothing and just loinskin. And then the next, we started developing some little clothing that was all uniform. And then, it became flowery in this big white dress. And so, is that the structure that the author intended? It's not, is it? We can't impose our own structure. We have to understand the author's intended order and structure to the story. And that's what this principle helps us get at. Some of the things we're looking for here, when we're looking for structure, we're looking for repetitions. Very often the biblical writers like to use repetition. And when things get repeated, that is intended to hold a unit of thought together. Makes sense, right? If you want to emphasize one particular thought, you repeat it several times throughout. There are repetitions. There are other kind of patterns that we see emerging. There's a movement from one place and then a return to that place. For example, there's some type of a pattern happening. The biblical writers like bookends. In other words, something is mentioned at the beginning of the unit of thought, and it's repeated again, showing you that he's closing out that thought. Or it begins in one way, and it ends in another way. And it shows you there's a conclusion to that unit of thought. So we're looking for things like that as we go through. All right, make sense? All right? So look for those things. As you read the scripture, look for those type of patterns. Now this is where our friend, the exciting parts of the Bible, the genealogies come in, right? The genealogies in the book of Genesis, anyway, are a structural marker. In other words, Moses is helping us here as he writes Genesis, because the genealogies are markers that a new unit of thought is beginning. And the pattern is genealogy followed by narrative. Genealogy followed by narrative. That is how he structures things. He even helps us. So you can see there's repetition of genealogy, and that's a structural marker. There are these patterns, genealogy followed by narrative, that helps us see the unit of thought. And what's so important about that is that we tend, if we look at Genesis just as Bible story after Bible story, what happens? What do we do with the genealogies?
We tend to just dismiss it.
Yeah. You just skip over them, right? I was working with a group of pastors, and we were looking at the questions about the narrative part. Boy, they were seeing it. And then I asked some questions about the genealogy. No, I said, why is this so hard, guys? Why can't you see what's being said right there? And someone said, well, because we usually just skip the genealogies. I said, if you skip the genealogies, in Genesis especially, you're going to miss the point of the story. Because the genealogy clues us in to what we should be looking for and understanding from the narrative stories. Now that's a whole different thing, isn't it? It's like reading a novel and skipping the first couple chapters. Are you going to know what's going on? You might pick up on some bits of story, but you won't understand where it's going. All right, so that's what's so important about this. And Moses does that for us, repeating these. And there's a particular phrase that he repeats as he introduces the genealogies. Take a look at Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4. We have the first of these. Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. How does it begin? Here is the history. These are the generations of, variously translated. But it begins in this way. These are the generations of. Now, we see that in chapter 2 and verse 4, right? How far does that go? What generations does he describe? Yeah, it's interesting, right? What's different about this genealogy? Chapter 2, verse 4. Yeah, right? That's a little strange, right? Here, there's a genealogy. What does this genealogy not have that you expect in a genealogy? There's no names, right? A genealogy with no names. Well, there is one name. Do you see it? Yeah. The Lord, and it's the genealogy of the heavens and earth. Okay. Very interesting. Now, where's the next one? Where's the next? These are the generations of. Yeah, there you go. You see it? Chapter 5, verse 1. You see it there? All right. How far does that genealogy go? All the way to Noah, right? And it covers the whole chapter. Chapter 5. So here we have a one-verse genealogy. Here we have the whole chapter, right? All right, very good. What do you notice? What else is different about the genealogy in chapter 5 and chapter 2, verse 4? Let's see. What's that? Okay, yes, there's years counted, right? Why are there no years here? Okay, yeah. But this is the beginning, right?
Before there was no time before.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
good.
going to take time, still.
Yeah. So this is the beginning. This is the very beginning of all the generations that are going to be upon the heaven and the earth that the Lord had created. Right? So this is just getting it kicked off. This is the beginning. Now you've got time. Years are being counted now from generation to generation. What else do you notice in chapter 5?
Naming the oldest son.
What's that?
Naming the oldest son.
Okay, not everybody who's born is being named, right? And he had other sons and daughters. So it's tracing a particular line, right? Particular descendants. Why would he be doing that? Okay, to carry the story, there's a particular story. So Genesis is not just giving us the history of the world. It is tracing a particular line with a particular story. All right? Where does he begin with this genealogy in 5:1? Begins with Adam, doesn't he? Oh, okay. But what's happened in chapter 2 to 4? Has Adam already been there? Okay. So he's going back. Do you notice it in verse 1? This is the book of the generations of Adam. So these are the generations that came from Adam along the particular line that God wants us to follow. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them. He blessed them and named them man when they were created. He refers back to God's creation and blessing of mankind in his image. Okay. So let's go back there. Where do we find that blessing upon mankind pronounced?
Genesis 1:28.
Yeah. Right? So there's a reference back to 128. And what's the blessing?
May be fruitful and multiply.
Fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. Subdue. Exercise dominion. Right? So here the genealogy, after the story that's happened in 2 to 4, we'll look at it a little more later. Now in chapter 5 it comes back and goes, as we said, from Adam to Noah. And refers back to these particular blessings. But what happens to these blessings when sin enters in chapter 3? What happens to fruitful and multiply?
It's still there.
It's still there, it's more difficult. Difficult in what way?
Pain for the woman, childbirth.
All right, there's pain, sorrow involved. That idea of sorrow in reference to the woman, as well as in reference to the ground, man working the ground, contains the idea of barrenness. All right? All right, how many times does God move the story forward through Genesis? Through a miraculous birth out of barrenness. Right? And so that's all part of the curse that comes. Subdue and dominion. What happens there with sin? Chaos. Yeah. Weeds, thorns, yeah. Sweat, the sweat of your brow. Right? Work now becomes hard, it's cursed. But what does God promise that answers and restores those?
It's about the seed of the woman and the first day.
Right. a seed, offspring, descendant of the woman, who will, so he will be a seed and offspring from being fruitful and multiplying, and he will crush the serpent's head, restoring dominion over the evil. He will do what Adam had failed to do. All right. So we see, do you see the connection now? Why does Moses structure Genesis with genealogies, with generations? What's he tracing?
The line to the sea.
Yeah, the line to the seed, right? And so Adam and Eve, they have other sons and daughters. Seth has other sons and daughters. Enoch has other sons and daughters. But here are the particular ones that lead to the fulfillment of God's promise. God pursuing his good purpose. His good purpose. Even through these sinful and cursed people. Now, who are these people in chapter 5? In this genealogy? Who are they? What else is said about them?
They will die.
They all die. You notice that gets repeated, doesn't it? It's almost like a formula, isn't it? He lived so many years, fathered this particular descendant, had other sons and daughters, and he died. And he died. Why? The curse of sin is still on them, right? And he died. Now, is there any exception to that? And he died. Enoch. Uh-huh. What happens to him? God took him. What else happened? What happened before God took him? He walked with God. He walked with God. And God took him. So God is showing that there is an exception to death for those who walk with him. All right? Then what happens? Is there anything special said about Noah? Special said about Noah?
Yes, Noah's father said that he named him Noah because it's restful and that he would comfort us in our labor and our hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. He'll bring us comfort. He'll bring us relief from the curse. There's hope, isn't there? There's hope in the seed. Is Noah the one who will bring us rest and relief from the curse? Well, we have to see what the story is. Right? What's the story connected with this genealogy? Chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. What's that story about? What's the narrative about? Yeah. How's it begin in chapter 6, verse 1? Oh, wonderful. They're being fruitful and multiply. There's this great hope with the birth of Noah. He's the one who will relieve us from the curse. And what happens? They're being fruitful and multiplying. Oh, wonderful. Things are going the way they should. Or are they? What happens? Corruption, yeah. How bad is it?
Great from the earth.
Yeah. The wickedness is great in there, right? Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil, continually. The Lord regrets He had made man. Look, the whole thing begins with the beginning of the genealogy of God creates man in his likeness and blesses him to be fruitful and multiply. But because of sin, as man multiplies, so does sin on the earth. But how does the narrative end? Verse 8. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, right? I don't think that was the name of his wife. It means that God gave him favor, right? God showed him grace. Was Noah among these wicked people? You know, if he found grace, then he must have been sinful also, right? And so the genealogy sets up, we're watching this line from Adam, who's blessed, and yet everyone dies, but there's an exception to that death because of sin with Enoch. And then there's great hope with Noah. But the whole place is so wicked, God's going to destroy, but Noah finds grace in the eyes of the Lord. Right? How is God going to pursue his good purpose? It's through this seed, but it is also by grace. Right? We start to see, here's how God can be just and yet still pursue his good purpose. People die. But Enoch was an exception. The whole world is going to be destroyed, but Noah is an exception by grace. Right? And so these genealogies become very important to understanding the point of the story that follows. And then the story causes us to reflect back upon who is identified in these genealogies. Now I just want to show you something. If we go back in chapter 2, this first genealogy, which is just the beginning of the generations, you'll notice, of course, in chapter 3, the curse comes, but also the promise of the seed. And then in chapter 4 and verse 1, what happens when the first child, Cain, is born? Chapter 4, verse 1.
Eve's hope was lifted when she forgot her son before the Lord.
Yeah.
And she had probably placed all her hope in him.
Aha, right? Yeah, she's looking for, she believes the promise. And when Cain is born, the Lord's given me a man. And there's hope that this will be the seed who will crush the serpent's head. Does it turn out that way? No. He actually crushes the head of the good guy in the story, right? Abel. Cain kills Abel. So Abel can't be the one because he's dead. Cain can't be the one because he's wicked and his descendants are wicked. Right? But what happens when Seth is born in chapter 4, verse 25?
But his hope is restored.
Hope is restored again. You see the bookend? The whole story of Cain and Abel, it's not about why was the good offering, why the bad offering. We spend too much time wasted on that. It's about there's hope in Cain being born, but he destroys that hope. Abel can't be the hope, but another child is born and hope is restored. Because fruitful and multiplying is happening to move toward the seed. You see that? All right. And what happens in verse 26 when Seth has a son?
It seems to be a renewal of the Bible, people calling upon the name of the Lord.
People begin to call upon the name of the Lord. like we're back to where it should be, right? People are calling on the name of the Lord. And in the next genealogy, that closes that unit of thought. Everything's, the generations are underway, and with the birth of Seth's son, people are calling on the name of the Lord, even though there's all this wickedness happening. Chapter 5 takes us back to the blessings of creation, looking for the seed, showing that through Noah, by grace, God's going to keep pursuing this good grace. You see how it goes? Okay. Now, where's the next one? These are the generations of. 6-9. We often lump 6:1 to 8 in with the story of Noah, don't we? It's actually the closing of this unit of thought. And then the new unit begins by telling us what about Noah? He was a righteous man, and he walked with God. We're starting to see a pattern, right? He's a righteous man, he walked with God. Don't forget, he was shown grace, and then we're told in the next unit of thought, he was a righteous man. Noah didn't survive on the ark because he was a righteous man. He was a righteous man walking with God because of grace. Right? That's why the structure is so important to rightly understanding the message that's being conveyed. Now, this genealogy is interesting. It begins in 6:9. Where does it end? Chapter 9, verses 28 to 29. How many people are in this genealogy? Oh, yeah, pretty much one. Noah and his sons are going to get a genealogy coming up. So pretty much this is about Noah, but look what happens here. Moses splits the genealogy and puts the narrative in the middle. You see that? These are the generations of Noah. Then 929, all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. You can't miss the pattern, right, from chapter 5. And so Moses wants us to understand this grace that God showed to Noah. Here's how it all played out. He gets his own genealogy and a big narrative story right in the middle of his genealogy to emphasize what God was doing through Noah at this time. All right? Then you've got all the rest of them. Let me write them here as our time moves. Chapter 10, verse 1. Chapter 11, verse 10. Chapter 11, verse 27. Chapter 25, verse 12. 25:19. 36:1. 36:9. And 37:2. 11, these are the generations of. Now notice some of these are pretty short. 25:12 to 19. Who's 25:12 about? Who? Ishmael, yeah, sorry. Thank you. Ishmael, right? Where does Ishmael go? He goes nowhere. So the genealogy is there because there's significance with Ishmael coming from Abraham. But that's not the story God's tracing. So his genealogy kind of dead ends, pardon the pun. Right? Who's 36:1 to 9? Who's 36:1?
That's Esau.
That's Esau. All right? Again, significant, the twin brother of Jacob. But that's not the way God's going to be working. So his genealogy comes to a dead end. And the story is about Jacob. All right? The last one, 37:2. Whose genealogy finishes out the book of Genesis, the last 13 chapters? Jacob. The whole story is about Joseph. Oh, no, it's not. The whole story is about Jacob. Joseph's story is about Jacob. Because Joseph is the one who's the main character in the story, but it's about the generations of Jacob. How did the generations of Jacob get preserved during famine in the Promised Land and under the Pharaoh down in Egypt? How did Jacob's generations get preserved? It's through Joseph. But it's about the preservation of Jacob's generations. Right? Because that's where the nation of Israel is going to be built from. So the genealogy is important to understanding the story that follows. All right, does that make sense? All right, wonderful. Any questions about that? Our time is at an end. But if you have any questions. What are you going to do with the genealogies from now on? Never again will you skip a genealogy, right? They're very important for the structure and therefore the message that the author has in mind. Yes?
How does